I imagine somebody who's listening to this or watching this, if that person used to be fit at one point in their life and now they've gained a bunch of weight, they're not as strong as they used to be, they're lacking motivation, but at the same time they want to get back to some resemblance of health and wellness. Like, what do you think is a good first step?
Getting started is always the toughest thing. And I mean, taking steps in whatever way is possible for you is probably the best thing to focus on first. People get into this mindset where they start to look at these things and they start to feel overwhelmed. They look at what they used to look like before, they look at what they look like now, and it's completely demotivating. And most of the time, what I find is the biggest issue for people is that they wait, or they try to wait for the perfect time period where like life all of a sudden aligns. All of a sudden you don't have any stress, you don't have job obligations, you don't have social obligations, and then you can finally focus on getting down to what you should have been doing the entire time. Anyway, so the first thing that I really like to talk about with people whenever they start to focus on this type of thing is you need to get out of your own head, because you're probably your own biggest enemy, at least to begin with. And so getting started is the most important thing. And I think that this focus on, I need to have the perfect plan, or I need to have the perfect situation and the perfect amount of motivation, is kind of looking at it from a wrong perspective. Because yes, you have to have a reason that you're going to want to do something, but motivation builds off of action. Motivation is often the result of action, not the cause of it. And so I think that the biggest mistake that most people make is that they think, oh, I need to be motivated to get started, when in reality, you just need to get started to get motivated. And so if we can start the conversation there before we get into some of the practical things that people can do, I think that that sets the stage for what can really be successful. And I know that people hate talking about mindset work, but it's critical. And it's literally the most important thing that you can possibly talk about, because the reality is a lot of different training programs work. A lot of different nutritional strategies work, but nothing works until you get started. And so if we can start to shift that mindset into that, then we can actually be successful down the road. Now, when you bring up the idea of, okay, well, somebody used to be fit and now they feel like they've kind of let themselves go and they want to get back into, feeling confident, feeling better in a bathing suit, looking good naked, performing better, health, all the different things that we want from a healthy lifestyle. What I would do first is I would evaluate the person and where they are. And that can kind of guide you into what you should focus on first. Because if we look at men and women, if you say, hey, look, this man is significantly greater than 20% body fat, or a woman that's significantly greater than 30% body fat. Well, the main focus that we should probably be looking at first is losing some of that excess body fat, because the biggest thing that you can do for your health is to remove some of that excessive body fat. Once we get down into 10 to 20% for men, 20 to 30% or so for women, then I think that the best thing that we can possibly do is shift our focus to maybe maximizing lean muscle building. Because even if you tell me, and even if a client tells me, hey, I used to be really fit and really in shape, most people probably didn't have as much lean muscle as they think that they did at that time. And that's probably the number one thing that can benefit people. And so when I get into these conversations with people, I'll first say, okay, well, where do you want to go? What is your ultimate goal? And if health, strength, performance, and particularly physique are parts of that, I think valuing building lean muscle and spending some significant time doing that rather than just focusing on, oh, I've got to always be in a calorie deficit, is probably the right mindset shift to finally get off of the diet roller coaster and be happy with where you are.
Yeah, because I do think that there's this irreplaceable feeling that comes with feeling like strong and feeling like you can move some weight and feeling like, you're improving your body composition. And I think you can't get there by just looking at calorie deficit.
You can't live in a calorie deficit for the rest of your life. And, there's a lot of people that will point out, okay, well, body recompositioning is a thing. You can lose body fat and gain muscle at the same time. Yes, that's true, but it might not be an appropriate plan for you. And the reason that I say that is because it is woefully slow for the majority of people. And if your progress is that slow and that's your focus, you're probably going to get demotivated over time. It works really well in like 4 categories. If you're brand new to training, if you're significantly obese, if you're coming back from a long layoff due to injury or whatever it is, and you had a lot of muscle to begin with, then it can be a beneficial thing. Or if you're on steroids. If you're not in any of these 4 categories, it's probably going to be very, very slow. And if you're having problems finding motivation to get started now, I guarantee you that it's going to be a very difficult thing to say, hey, look, I'm going to commit myself to 2-3 years of this slow, arduous process to get where I want to be. Yes, it can work, but are you mentally and emotionally prepared to do that? And I think laying out the expectations here is probably a really good thing from the start, because if you know that this is the case, you can either, one, prepare yourself for it and be comfortable and patient in the process, which would be optimal. Or two, you might say, okay, well, I'm not really as patient as I would hope to be in that situation. And that's when you start to shift that idea of, okay, well, if going slow and steady and taking the scenic route isn't the right move for you, that's where we start to say, okay, well, let's get down into that 10 to 20% body fat for men, that 20 to 30% body fat for women, and then do some cycles of cutting and being in a slight calorie surplus to build muscle, because you're going to likely progress faster doing that than doing a dedicated recomp phase. But the entire thing here is that there are multiple paths to get where you want to be. So as long as you're educated on those, you can make the right choice for you. And I think that this is the problem that most people have, is that they don't have a distinct idea of how to get there or what options that they have. And so that's why I try to give these recommendations of the 10 to 20% or the 20 to 30%. And I'm not saying that you need to go out and get, like an in-body scan, because those things are. But what you can do is you can take some photos, from the front, from the side, and then compare them to, there's a lot of different things on, the internet, Google, that'll show this is what 15% body fat looks like for a man. This is what 18% looks like for a man. This is what 20% looks like for a man. And you just gauge it. And it's okay. You don't have to be 100%, on point for those types of things to gain some benefits from this. But when you look at that and you say, okay, well, I'm roughly 20 to 25%. Well, then I would ask a person, okay, well, if I told you as a male that 20 to 25% is slightly higher than what we would want to initiate a building phase, you can if you want there. But if I'm telling you that it's slightly higher and you tell me I would feel more comfortable with a little less body fat, well, there you go. You just told yourself exactly what you want to do. Your main focus is now losing some body fat. Get down until you're a little bit more comfortable, switch out of that calorie deficit, start to add calories back in over time, and then switch into that focus on building muscle. But the big thing here is we want to, one, make you healthier first. Health is always the number one thing. After we start to get into a healthy range, then we have to come to grips with the fact that we probably can't live our lives in a calorie deficit. And this is one of the biggest errors that I see clients make, or people online make in general, is that they think that they need to live in a calorie deficit the entire time. One, to get where they want to be, or two, to be happy. And that's why people struggle so much, because you can only go so long without fueling yourself before you start to feel like crap. You start to realize that you're not building as much muscle as you possibly want. You start to not perform as well as you possibly can. And so assuming that you're not in these higher body fat categories, that you're not obese, I would spend at least half the year, if not more, at maintenance level of calories or slightly above. And I think that this is the mindset that we really need to shift if we want people to be successful long term.
I think one of the other limiting beliefs that happens, you talked about men, body fat, is that men who, have gotten older, they developed, I guess, what's called now dad bod, right? Where they're like, all right, I'm a dad, I've got a family, like this is just what it is. I think sometimes what happens is the thoughts come in like, oh, I'm getting older. I don't know if I can get back to like peak physical condition. Oh, like, this is just the way it is. I have to prioritize my family and my kids, which I think is important. However, I do think it's also important to prioritize your health. What do you tell somebody that is just being accepting of this condition, of this physique that they've developed because they haven't been taking care of themselves?
You never have to accept that. And I know that people have different challenges, and I know that people have different time constraints and all the different type of things that people will come up with excuses. And I'm not saying this as an aggressive thing. What I'm saying is I've never worked with a single person that couldn't use some time management skills. There's never been a single person that I've ever worked with that we couldn't say, hey, look, let's break up a little bit of time here and here. Maybe you can get only 2 or 3 workouts in a week, but 2 or 3 workouts are better than nothing. And you can progress very, very well on 3 workouts a week if you have the right ones in play. I mean, I think that what we really want to do first is really focus on all the benefits that this can bring, and then put this in perspective with the life that they live. I mean, if you build more lean muscle and strength, you're going to massively reduce injury risk. And if I were to ask you, Doug, if you were to talk with Gen Pop and you ask them, what's the number one thing that you think will help reduce injuries? What do you think most people would say?
To not lift heavy.
Well, to not lift heavy could be one of them, but I would probably say it's, hey, you need to be stretching. That's one that I get a lot. But it's funny because if we look at the research that looks at this, I mean, stretching only reduces injury risk from anywhere from 0 to 4%. It's next to nothing. Strength training itself reduces injury risk 69%. So you're telling me that you have a family that you need to take care of. You're telling me that you want to be healthy to be able to be parts of their lives. Hey, you need to be strength training. I mean, strength training is one of the number one things. Strength training has been shown to reduce injury risk by 69%. So 69% versus 0%, it kind of makes sense to put our effort into one of these things that really makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, strength training improves bone health, mood and energy, enhances recovery, brain and cardiovascular health, metabolic health and metabolism, but most importantly, it increases quality of life and longevity. So if you care about your kids, you want to spend a lot of time with them. You want to be there for them as they grow up. You want to be able to carry them. You want to be able to, go on hikes with them and be active with them. This is one of the things that you have to do to take care of yourself. And even more important than this, because one of the biggest things that parents will always say, men and women, and I understand why they say this, is they say, oh, well, I've got to spend this time, doing all these things with my kids or working and all that. Your example is worth far more than you realize. And so if you grow up and you're constantly telling people that you don't have the time to do this, your kid's going to take from that. They're going to take away from that health takes a backseat. They're going to take away, hey, I can't make this work in my daily life. You're not going to be that example that's there for them. So I urge people to do what you can do. And even if that's working out twice a week in whatever way that you can. I mean, maybe you're only doing body weight workouts at home, but you're an example for them. You are something that is going to benefit them decades after you are gone, and you're doing it without even realizing that you're doing it. Prioritizing your health is taking care of your family. It's going to make you a better parent. It's going to make you a better example for them. It's going to give them confidence. If you can't do it, you're going to demotivate your kids without even realizing it. So for the people that tell me, oh, there's absolutely no time, there's no way to do this, make the time. You don't have to make all the time, and if you in college, if you were working out 5 days a week, maybe you don't have the time for that. But you got time to do something. So figure out where you can do it, because the payoffs to this are going to trickle down into far more avenues than you're currently aware of.
And I'd love to get into programming for strength training, regarding men and people who are looking to get out of this rut and kind of get back to where they were. I think one of the biggest problems is that they don't have the time to work out like they did in college. And they also know that working out a few days a week, or they think working out a few days a week, won't stimulate enough change for it to be worth it to them. You know what I mean? You'll hear people say, what is 2 days a week going to do? What's 3 days a week going to do? And I know that's not true. So I would love to hear your thoughts on, just say somebody is listening to this or watching this. They're like, you know what, dude, I don't have the time to commit to 5 days a week anymore, but I still want to make sure I'm seeing results. What should the program look like?
Well, if you only have a couple days, it should be full body, because you're going to be using compound lifts as your bread and butter, because it's going to give you the most bang for your buck. You're not going to be able to stay into the gym, 2-3 hours at a time. You're just going to do junk volume for a large portion of that. So what you want to do is you want to get the most bang for your buck. You're going to be doing those basic standard lifts that are engaging for a large portion of your musculature, which is why we do compounds. But just to make people feel better about this, there's a bunch of research looking at the minimal effective dose for things like hypertrophy and strength training. And if we look at hypertrophy, we've got 2 avenues of study they're actually very reassuring for people that have this mindset. As few as 4 sets per week taken to failure has been shown to build lean muscle. Even less, we have one where it showed that if you take 1 set to failure, but spread it out over twice per week, you do the frequency, you do, 1 set really hard, like on Monday, do 1 set really hard on Thursday, that even caused growth when you split it up. The key here is not, can you get into the optimal range? Because yes, there's going to be an optimal range, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can do it at this time period in your life. The key is doing whatever you can do, and knowing that it can be as simple as maybe just 4 sets per week. That's super easy to do. So if you're going to get in there, you're going to deadlift, overhead press, bench press, like a curl, like you can get 5 or 6 exercises in there that are pretty much going to cover most everything. You're going to do just fine. The important thing is what most people miss out on. I think that when people lift, unless you've been taught this and unless you've actually learned to get through this, people just don't lift with enough intensity. They think that they are, but they're not. If we look at people that are not rote beginners, you have to be taking sets between 0 and 2 reps short of failure. It has to be close to failure. Otherwise, you're not stimulating the muscle enough. And what I normally see is if I give people 4 sets and they're just starting out as a client, before we start doing the intensity tests and stuff like that I put into play in my coaching, the first 2 or 3 sets out of those 4 sets are just glorified warm-ups. They're not taking it close enough to failure. And even when we do research and we test people, this is what we see. We see when we tell people to take, choose a weight that you think that you can do for 10 reps and you're going to be pretty much right at failure. They're usually about 5 reps off. Now that works when you're a rote beginner. If this is your first year of training, it may work. And this is why people will start training that way. And they'll think, oh, well, it worked. And now I'm plateaued and I don't know what to do. Well, you don't know what to do because you weren't ever really working in the intensity that you should have been working at. You were working at an intensity that worked during the newbie gains period. But now that you've leveled up, it's going to take a little bit more. And so my biggest message to people that are wanting to actually make some progress in this is to really focus on making your working sets actually working sets and not glorified warm-ups, because every time we test this in the research, it shows that people are significantly off. Discomfort is something that you really need to push through. And I know that old phrase of no pain, no gain gets thrown around a lot, and that's not true. We don't want acute stabbing pains. We don't want neurological symptoms. Like if it's going numb or you're like losing your balance or something like that, then you're doing something wrong. But if you're getting that deep down burn, if you're getting soreness, if you're like, oh man, I'm just having problems contracting, fight through that. That's exactly what you need to learn to push through. And this is the type of thing that people will start to have some discomfort in their life. And we've become a society of people that love to be pampered and never love to face any sort of adversity in our lives. And unfortunately, it's bleeding over into things like fitness. And this is something that we need to unlearn. We need to realize that this is like an old Marcus Aurelius quote, but the obstacle is the way. That challenge is what you should want, because when you can push through that discomfort, that's when you're finally going to come out on that other side. And your body's going to say, okay, I'm actually being challenged enough that I need to adapt to this stimulus that's being faced here. And if you focus on that on every single set of your working sets, you're going to do just fine. Now, this is where we get that discrepancy with, there's a lot of people that will say, hey, like a lower to moderate volume range, when you're using your intensity correctly, is probably more beneficial for growth than these super high volume programs that we see out there. Now, the people that do these really high volume programs and see progress, it's not because that high volume program is smarter. It's probably because they're making up for poor intensity. And so if you're doing 12 or 15 sets in a workout, that can work extremely well. But if your half of those are glorified warm-ups, well, yeah, you might need to go up to like 30 or 40 total sets in a workout. And that's why we see these discrepancies. And that's why we see these different people saying, well, only high volume works for me. Well, only high volume works for you, probably because your intensity. And that's likely why we're in that range. So when people are setting these things up, there are differences in how you set up strength training versus hypertrophy training. And it's good to know these things. The intensity part of it is really the focus that people should be having. If you are training purely for strength, you probably shouldn't be going over more than 15 total sets in an entire workout. Because if you are, your intensity is probably not there. And the reality is, with strength training workouts, we're probably lifting really heavy for a lot of the lifts. If your focus is hypertrophy work, you probably shouldn't be above 10 sets or so per muscle group in a single day. Because going significantly beyond that, I mean, if somebody says I'm at 12 and I'm comfortable there, I'm saying, okay, that's fine. If you go significantly above like 10 or 12, you're probably putting in a lot of junk volume. And for people that are just beginning training, this can seem extremely low. But that's the way that it is. And I think that what really confuses people is when they look at this hypertrophy research that's out there that looks at volume, they'll hear, okay, what the research shows is that 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week is where the sweet spot is for the best growth without massive diminishing returns. Yes, you can see a little bit more growth after that 18 or 20 sets per muscle group per week, but the return for that is basically minimal. And there's a lot more fatigue buildup. So it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense for most musculature to do that. What people don't realize is when we're looking at this research, they include fractional sets. And people don't understand what fractional sets are. So when I make a program for somebody and they're like, well, you only gave me 12 sets of, you only gave me like 8 or 10 sets of triceps for the entire week, but like 10 to 20 is optimal. So like, I feel like you're really undershooting me. And I'm like, hold up. I gave you 8 sets of triceps, and then you have 10 sets of chest exercise, chest pressing and overhead pressing. And so technically you're probably like 18, because those chest presses, those overhead presses, they'll count as a half or a third of a triceps movement in these research studies. And so people don't realize that these super high volume training programs are typically because they're either basing it off of guys that are on all of the steroids in the world from the 80s and 90s that used to do these really large programs, and they may not translate to a natural lifter anyways. Or they're people misinterpreting the research, thinking that when it says 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week, that means 10 to 20 dedicated sets in just that muscle. And that's not the case. That's not what these studies are looking at. But people don't understand that fractional sets are being used. And so what you're getting at the end of the week is a training program that's so god awful in volume that it's destroying all of their intensity, and it's making them more sore. And sure, you might feel like, hey, the soreness is a really good thing because that means that my workout worked, but that is not a sign of a good workout. And so it's one of those things that people are just misinterpreting what's happening. And they are building up unnecessary fatigue, and they're spending unnecessary amounts of time. And no, you're telling me that you don't have time to work out, because your workouts are trash and you're spending twice as much time as you possibly need to actually get where you want to go. So when people say, oh, well, 2 days a week isn't enough to progress. 2 days a week is fine. 3 days a week isn't enough to progress. That's complete, because 3 days a week you can progress really well. And so if people were to come to me and they were to say, hey, what's the optimal amount of days that a person should work out if there's no obligations that are getting in the way? 3 to 5 days are great for weight training, optimally. 2 can work. 6 is probably too much. I mean, 6 days of weight training, I know that people program a PPL times 2 often, but IFBB pros don't typically work out 6 days a week on weights. And so people really need to get in the mindset of, okay, well, maybe I need to value these things like intensity a lot more than what I valued them in the past, because I'm probably doing a lot more work than I thought. I'm probably spending all this time that I could be doing something else with. Maybe that you've got more time to meal prep. Maybe we've talked about things like your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, all those movements that you do throughout the day that aren't dedicated exercise that can add to body fat loss. That's one of your big goals anyways. Maybe you spend more time walking in the time that you would have spent doing these god-awful high-volume programs. And I'm not against high-volume programs if your recovery is on point. But these high-volume programs really only make sense for a person that has no other job, no other obligations. Maybe they're training twice per day. Maybe they can eat as much as they possibly want. Maybe they're sleeping 9 hours a night. If that's not you, that's not the right training program. And so people are really setting themselves up for failure and saying, hey, I don't have the time to do this, but it's because you're training. And this is not to get down on you. This is to say you weren't aware of it, and you can't be blamed for what you weren't aware of. And even a lot of these coaches that are out there don't understand what fractional sets are when they look at this research. So they'll tell you, you need to be getting 20 working sets per muscle group per week. And you're like, okay, well, the coach said that. And they'll show you a study and it'll say 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week. And you'll say, okay, he backed it up. He didn't really back that up. He just didn't really understand what he was saying, and it was kind of misrepresented to you. And that doesn't mean that they were a bad coach. That means there's a lot of layers to this. And that's why we get into these deep conversations, because being able to talk about this and really understanding what it's saying can make you say, okay, maybe it doesn't take as much as I thought. And maybe it doesn't take as much as I thought because I wasn't training the right way. And maybe if we start to put all these things into perspective, and maybe if I start to, get my practices down with how I meal prep, maybe if I start to lean on an Instant Pot a little bit more, maybe all of this time opens up. And then I finally can do this. And then I can get all those benefits. Then I can live longer. And it's not just about living longer. It's about living a better life as you live longer. And you know what is required to do that? Having some lean muscle. It's a very important thing. Getting rid of that excess body fat that's going to add to that systemic inflammation that's going to cause all these problems. And this is the way that you do it, by setting up proper nutrition and training programs. And if you don't know how to do that, that's when you sign up with somebody like Doug or I. I mean, that's exactly what helps there, at least to get you started and get you on the right track. And I always point it out as like, I have a doctorate in surgery. I could learn to fix a car. I have no idea what I'm doing with fixing a car, and it's not worth my time to learn it. And so when I need help there, I'm going to hire a mechanic, and I'm going to get it fixed, and I'm going to do it right, and I'm going to do it with a lot less stress, and I'm going to do it in a lot less time. That is what you're doing when you're hiring a person like Doug or myself for these types of things. And this is not like a sales thing. We need to put these things into proper perspective, because people are screwing up because they don't know what they don't know. And there's a lot of nuance to this. Yes, the process is relatively simple, and there's a lot of different ways that you can get there, but it's not easy. And if you don't know what you don't know where these hurdles are that are causing you to stumble. And yes, this is why, if you have the dad bod, you're feeling frustrated. You have the dad bod because you don't know these things. And so figuring out what you don't know, working with a coach, 3, 4, 6 months could change your life for the rest of your life, because all of a sudden you found all those holes in your program that you didn't know existed.
And like you said, there is layers to this. And the reason I say that is I totally agree. And I know that it's been clear to me after not just talking to you, but others, about like what the research says about programming, building muscle, etc. I do think it's also important to consider, for people that are committed, like individualization. Like I know for me, like I personally, I've done it all. I've done full body workouts 2 days a week, 3 days a week. I've done one body part a day. I've done push pull legs. I've done the Arnold split. I've tried everything. And for me, I saw results with all of them. Like I remember doing, I remember I really looked forward to like chest day back when I was younger. There was no greater feeling than an arm pump.
You pulled out the Arnold book earlier.
Yeah, I did. And so I do think that, I think what you said is spot on. People need to just make sure that they're doing things right and focusing on intensity and not just getting in a bunch of junk sets. But they also need to figure out like what is going to be something they can adhere to long term and keep it in line with what they want to do as far as their goals and their lifestyle. I guess my next question, taking this a step further, what are some small tweaks that people can make in the gym that people need to make that will help them accelerate progress?
I mean, this goes back to that whole intensity type of thing. I mean, that's the number one thing that people really need to do. I mean, you might have noticed that there was a reel that I put out literally yesterday, and I think that's kind of poignant for this question. I think that there are a lot of online physiotherapists out there, and they've become very, very famous for fear-mongering a lot of stuff. You can't do this. You have to get down perfect form. You have to do all these different things. But when you look at the research and this type of stuff, perfect form is a myth, first off, because we all have different levers. I mean, if you look at different people squatting, I don't know how tall you are, but I'm 6'1". And if I followed the recommendations for squatting that you see in the majority of online circles, I would never be able to squat. And so you need to understand that there is significant variation in technique for a lot of these different things. So one of the biggest issues that I find, and you're talking about what are these small tweaks that people can make, and what kind of mindset shifts can we make to really make our time in the gym actually pay off? One of the biggest things that I typically find is that people will spend years and years and years trying to get perfect technique down, when that is completely unachievable for most people, and 2, unnecessary. What we want, rather than perfect technique, is we want adequate technique. When you can achieve adequate technique, when you have proficiency in a movement, when you're able to go through an entire movement, full range of motion, balance, and you feel comfortable, that's it. Then start working on that intensity. That's when you start loading on those weights, and I think that this is where people get into a lot of issues, because there's a lot of physiotherapists that will say, hey, until you can, I'm thinking of one that tells people that until you can do a pistol squat, you're not allowed to barbell back squat. And that is literally the dumbest crap that I've ever heard, because a pistol squat's a lot more difficult than learning a barbell back squat. I mean, if you've got issues with strength and, and balance and stuff like that, a bilateral movement is going to be much easier. And on top of that, you don't need to make your life really difficult to start. Because even things like machines, like machine squat, hack squat, all these different things, people talk about functional training. Functional training is a myth. There's no such thing as functional training. It's a marketing scam. And if you look at research that looks at things like a machine squat versus a barbell back squat, they have the same functional carryover to life. And it's a big myth that, oh, if I don't use a barbell back squat, I'm not going to have any balance. It's 100% not true. You continuously build up balance, musculature. You continuously build up soft tissue strength by using these machines. And I'm not saying forego things like barbell back squat, but if your goal is to start to improve and you don't know where to start, hey, if you feel more comfortable with machines, start off with machines. Start to build up that soft tissue strength. Start to build up that, lean muscle and total absolute strength. And I think that people get confusion about this type of thing because they don't really understand what carries over to real world function. There are two things that determine real world function. There's a neurological component, and then there's a morphological component. The neurological component is, building motor patterns and all those different kinds of movements. The problem is the motor patterns that you build in real functional movements are extremely movement specific. So a deadlift is not necessarily going to carry over to like lifting up a couch from a neurological perspective. The barbell back squat is not necessarily going to carry over to jumping or whatever it is that you're trying to say is functional. And so if you want to get functionally better at a movement from a neurological perspective, you have to do that movement. If you want to get better at jumping, you better be jumping. If you want to get better at a barbell back squat, you've got to do a barbell back squat. There's a very high specificity of training from a neurological standpoint. So that means that the other part of the equation is extremely interesting, the morphological component. That is building muscular size and strength is a universal benefit to function. If you build a stronger, bigger muscle, no matter how you do it, if you are doing a Smith machine deadlift versus a regular deadlift, then anything that uses that same musculature in real life, like picking up a couch, will benefit because a bigger, stronger muscle functions in real life no matter what you're doing. Whatever movement that muscle is engaged in, it will carry over. And that's why when we look at this research that looks at functional capacity between machines and free weights, we see the same outcomes in functional movements. So if you take something like a squat from a barbell back squat, and we take something like a squat from a machine squat, and then we test a person's jump, exact same benefits. There's no difference. And so there's a very interesting carryover. And I think that when we talk about, well, what are these different things that people can look at to really tweak the benefits and outcomes that they have in real life, getting rid of some of these myths can be very beneficial because then, to your point earlier, you talked about, hey, preference has comes a lot into play here, because if you're doing something that you enjoy more than something that you don't enjoy, you're going to be much more likely to stick to it. And knowing that you don't have to do a barbell back squat unless you want to get better at barbell back squat. There's a lot of different ways that you can improve functional capacity. There's a lot of different ways that you can improve, leg strength and leg size. Well, then don't pick the one that you hate. Pick the one that you hate the least. If you hate Bulgarian split squats, I'm sorry, you should probably be doing Bulgarian split squats. But if you hate those, then pick another unilateral leg movement that you enjoy more. Do lunges. There's a lot of different variations of those. Do split squats. And so there's a lot of different ways to get where you want to be. And as long as we start to cut out some of these myths, like, oh, you can never use the Smith machine because it doesn't carry over to real life. That carries over very well, as long as you're doing, the right movements to whatever you're trying to carry over. Another example of this kind of thing where they talk about functional movements is if functional movements were a real thing, you would think that if we're doing a barbell back squat, a half squat or a quarter squat or a 90-degree squat would carry over to jumping more than a full ass to grass squat, right? I mean, that would make sense because you're not jumping from your butt down at your heels. But if you look at actual research, the full ass to grass squat enhances jump performance more than that 90-degree squat. Now, that doesn't make any sense if you're listening to the functional trainers out there, because it's not in the same position, but it carries over more because what were the two things that we talked about? Neurological component and morphological component. The morphological component, the building of size and strength, is better the deeper that you go, assuming you can go that deep. So in the majority of the movements that you do, taking things to end ranges of motion where you have the mobility, where you're comfortable, and loading it at the end ranges of motion and doing that full range of motion training tends to be better as the base of your workout for a reason. It tends to, particularly in leg, it tends to build the morphological component better. And that's why we see, despite the fact that a half rep, a 90-degree squat would make more sense from a jumping perspective, since that's where you're jumping from, the full squat actually gives better results. So there's a lot of nuance to this, and I don't think that the functional training people are really focused on this stuff. But when the question was, what are these little tips and tweaks that we can do, particularly if we're working with a community like you're talking about with the dad bod, you've got kids and you've got, work obligations, you've got social obligations. Yeah, your time is limited. So let's stop fucking around with these things that aren't going to really make a difference and actually focus on what does make a difference. And if you do that, you're going to get the most benefits out of the training that you're doing. And you're not going to have to worry about this minutia that sounds cool on the surface, but doesn't really translate to increased progress. And in many cases, like the functional half squats, less progress. And so certainly if you get, not to cut you off too much, but just one last thought, certainly if your goal is, hey, I don't have that much time, I need to maximize the return here, do full range of motion training, take that intensity in proximity to failure, and use whatever method you want to use, whether it's a machine, whether it's cables, whether it's, whatever it is that keeps you engaged with losing the least amount of motivation long term, and you're going to be fine.
This episode is brought to you by Timeline Nutrition. Listen, my main goals for the remainder of the year revolve around health and vitality. After hearing about Timeline Nutrition from several of my friends in the health industry, I decided to give their flagship product, MitoPure, a try. MitoPure contains urolithin A, which is a powerful postbiotic that can be challenging to get from your diet. As you know, science has been a big focus on the podcast, so I was really impressed that Timeline has done 10 years of research to bring this product to market. I've been taking their berry powder for over a month now, and have already noticed a bit of a difference in the gym. Some of the long-term benefits I'm hoping to achieve from taking it include improved energy, muscle strength, and endurance, which are right in line with my goals. So I highly recommend you check out Timeline Nutrition, and they are now offering 10% off your first order of MitoPure. So just go to timeline.com/Doug to get 10% off your first order of MitoPure. That's TIMELINE.com/Doug. Now back to the show. Well, and I think you mentioned like the half squat and jumping, and it's like, I think one of the other reasons that going full range of motion helps more is because when you break 90 degrees, you activate the glutes more, right? And the glutes are what creates a lot of power in your legs for when you're doing, things like jumping and sprinting and stuff, right? And, I think like comparing the back squat to like leg press and even like the hack squat, I guess in my opinion is I agree with you on what you said. I think like the benefits I see to the back squat, if you're somebody who's like, like I want to do something that's going to crush my legs, work my core, work my CNS, I can easily track this. I want to like, really like build some like brute strength and focus on like that movement, then obviously the back squat is probably like the way to go. But if you're like, like I just want to build muscle, I want to focus on getting stronger, I want to be able to make sure that I'm doing things properly, full range of motion, then you can get like 95% of the way there with a leg press, hack squat, etc. I mean, in my opinion, I think the main benefit to doing the back squat is the CNS, working your core, maybe some of the stability muscles that are required with you, like having to balance a bar on your back versus being in a fixed position on a hack squat. But, I'd love to hear like your thoughts on that too.
I don't want to badmouth the barbell back squat because that almost feels like what I'm doing here. But what I'm doing, but there's nothing wrong with barbell back squat. And if you love barbell back squat, certainly do barbell back squat. There's a lot of great things. There has never really been any research to suggest that you're going to get a lot better balance doing barbell back squat than you're going to get doing anything else. I mean, it shows stabilizer muscles are work just fine in some of these other things as well. Now, are you going to get better at doing a barbell back squat? Yes, you are. And so this is one of those personal preference things, I think. And my biggest thing is, okay, if as an individual, particularly for taller people, you're going to have a harder time feeling motivated to do barbell back squat, particularly because you just don't feel it that much in your quads. Because as you get taller, if you've got longer femurs specifically, you're going to have to spread your stance. And then you may have to go low bar in your setup. And so what ends up happening is you tend to feel these almost entirely in your adductor magnus and in your glutes. And so if people come to me and they say, hey, I really want to like blast my quads and all that, well then, for a taller lifter, it may actually make more sense to spend more time doing Smith machine squats and hack squats than it does barbell back squat, because it's something where you can bring that stance in, and those balance demands kind of go out the window a little bit. And I know that people are like, okay, well, if you're a taller lifter, then all you need to do is stretch. And it's like, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily work. And it doesn't necessarily work because the longer femurs become problematic, and you literally cannot squat in the same way that a smaller person can. And there's a thing called Celtic hip and there's a thing called Dalmatian hip. So this is another consideration, and this can be a beneficial thing for the people that are listening when they're trying to decide, okay, well, what do I need to do? If you're a power lifter, you have to barbell back squat. So if you're doing a sport that requires it, sorry, you got to do it. If you're doing things because you want to live life well, you want to build muscle, you want to build strength, these are the types of times where you bring these types of things in consideration. So the hip socket, bony anatomy, can account for a very large proportion of a person's mobility or flexibility. And there's nothing that you can do about it. It doesn't matter how much you stretch. Now, the good news is taking strength training to end ranges of motion and loading them under load at those end ranges of motion will increase flexibility as much as a static stretching routine. So if you're going as deep as you can, and that's why I said earlier, go as far as your mobility allows under load, you're going to increase your flexibility as much as it possibly can over time just by doing a strength training routine. The problem with barbell back squat for these taller lifters, and the only reason that I'm focusing on this is because I want to give people some nuance that was never given to me when I was growing up. And if I had this, I think I would have been much more successful for decades in lifting. The hip socket has different anatomy. And with the way that the femur attaches into the hip socket, if this is your hip socket, there's something called a Celtic hip where the hip socket is very deep. Or there's something called a Dalmatian hip where it's very shallow. If you have Dalmatian hip, you can move that femur really far. If you've got Celtic hip, you're stuck. Doesn't matter how much you stretch, you're always going to be stuck. And so one of the things that we see is Eastern Europeans and the Chinese are extremely good at Olympic weightlifting. And there's a reason. They all have very shallow hip sockets. There's a reason that you do not see any British or Celtic people in the finals in Olympic weightlifting, because the anatomy precludes it. It does not matter how much they stretch. It is a genetic thing. So when we talk about squatting, a barbell back squat for somebody that has shorter femurs or has very shallow hips, they can keep their stance very narrow and they can do that ass to grass movement. Whereas somebody with Celtic hip is going to have to compensate by opening up your hips, spreading your legs wide, putting it lower on your back. So you have to do that low bar back squat. And so you might not feel the same type of stimulation as some of these other exercises. So when we're talking about this type of thing, when I'm talking about this type of thing with clients, I'll say, okay, well, how tall are you? How comfortable do you feel getting down deep in a back squat? Let me see some videos of you doing this. What is your preference in movements? Do you feel like you have to get better and better and better at barbell back squat? And then you make the decision based off of that, because the reality is that somebody may just not be built for barbell back squatting. Whereas if they switch over to things like Bulgarian split squat, the hack squat, the Smith machine squat, they might have much greater progress in a much easier manner. And they might have just been banging their head against a wall because they grew up and everyone's like, you have to barbell back squat. And so there are people that are very, very well built for barbell back squatting. They tend to have shorter femurs. They tend to have longer torsos. They tend to be shorter overall. They tend to be of Eastern European or Chinese descent. Your Asian descent, I mean, Koreans do really well with this type of thing. I have not seen a whole lot of Japanese in Olympic weightlifting, but Asians in general tend to have shallower hip sockets. And women tend to have slightly shallower hip sockets, which is why they tend to do really, really well with some of the deeper squatting. But if you ever look at like an Olympic weightlifter and you see those knees go like significantly out beyond the tips of the toes, it's because they're able to get down really, really deep because their hip anatomy allows it. And so this is kind of a tangent off of what you were asking before, but it's important to understand these types of things, because then both as a coach and as an athlete, you can make some decisions on how you want to program. And if we know that there's not a massive difference in the functional outcomes, if we know that there's not a massive difference in hypertrophy or strength outcomes, well, then you've got some autonomy there. And that's a great thing, because these people can now feel like they're not pigeonholed into having to do something that make their knees hurt. Maybe they can switch up to something else. If people are always telling you, well, you have to go really deep or you have to go to grass, well, that's preferable if you can. And to your point, it does engage the glutes more. And that's probably why you see more performance from those different types of movements. And it's actually protective for the knee if you can get down there. There's something called the wrapping effect on the knee ligaments and all the soft tissues in the knee. So going deep is not even worse from an injury standpoint in people that can go deep. The issue is if you've got a shallow hip socket and you're not tracking forward very far, well, then the only thing that you can do is your back starts to tip. And so instead of your back angle being like up and nicely upright here, like it is on shorter people, all of a sudden you're now having to like do this majorly to compensate for it, to keep the bar, centered over midfoot. And so that's why we start to see the low bar movements, because those guys that do the low bar movements typically cannot do high bar because of things like that anatomy. So it's a preference thing. And I would say if somebody's talking about this type of thing and they really want to improve it, ask yourself, okay, well, what can I do? What are my requirements? And if you're not a power lifter, then you've got a lot of room to move.
Shifting gears into nutrition. Obviously, this plays a huge role in health, wellness, whatever your goal is, nutrition matters. What are, in your opinion, the non-negotiables, like the golden rules of nutrition that you believe people should follow, taking out like individualization? Let's just talk like from a general perspective.
You need to be basing the large majority of your nutrition based on whole foods. I mean, I'm not somebody that's out here that is, I won't tell a person, oh, well, you can't ever have a Diet Coke, or you can't have, like a chocolate bar or whatever it is. But the reality is that whole minimally processed foods provide a lot of benefits that ultra processed foods don't. And so rather than looking at things as good or bad, it helps to look at things on like a continuum. And there are more nutritious foods and less nutritious foods. And so you need to be basing the majority of your intake off of more nutritious foods. If we want to talk about some of those outcomes, ultra processed food diets are associated with lower levels of lean muscle mass. I mean, people who predominantly consume ultra processed foods have 60% lean muscle mass on average, or 60% greater risk of low muscle mass on average. And, there's a couple things that if you look at people that have less body fat or that lose excess body fat and are able to keep it off, there's a couple things that are always pretty common according to the research. I mean, the people tend to cook for themselves. They limit fast food and they tend to have lower food variability. And I think that this is one of those things that from a nutrition standpoint is very, very important, because I think that people don't value the benefits that cooking your own food brings. They'll look at things like, okay, well, even if I'm tracking macros, I'm going to use things like menus and use the calorie counts there. You can't really do that. And you can't do that because on average, those menus are off by 20%. They typically have 20% more calories than what they claim on a menu. In some cases in the research, it's off by as far as 250%. So you may be putting in that you took 200 calories in, and you may be getting something like 500 calories. But you're believing that you've taken it in. So the more often that you eat out, the more that this compounds. And so I've got people that'll come to me and they'll be like, oh, well, I'm eating 1,200 calories a day. And I'll look at their food logs and they're ordering out all the time. And it's like, well, you say that you're eating 1,200 calories per day, but you might be eating 2,200 calories per day. And you might not even realize it. And this is one of the big issues that you're potentially having. And so if we know that these things are off, and they're off for a variety of reasons. They're off because, one, I mean, the FDA is not going out to your local restaurant and checking to make sure that these things are right. Two, you've got a different chef that's doing this, and they're doing it by hand. There's nobody back there with a scale measuring things by gram. They're not saying, okay, this is 100 grams of chicken so we can make sure to have the right macros. They're not doing that. They're throwing the chicken down. They're throwing they're cooking with different amounts of butter. They're putting on different amounts of sauce or whatever it is, marinade or, whatever it is. And so you're getting different amounts every time. There's no standardization. Even with things like those take-home meal companies, they're not standardized. And I think that people don't really realize that. Now, yes, you can use those if that makes your life easier, at least to start. But when you start to stall out, this is one of those big things that you need to start taking control of, and you need to start cooking for yourself, because it's going to make a really big difference here. The other thing outside of cooking for yourself out of whole minimally processed foods, because you've got a much better chance to have right calorie levels, is to lower the variance in the types of foods that you eat on a daily. Have 2 or 3 options for breakfast, have 2 or 3 options for lunch, have 2 or 3 options for dinner, and that's it. And this can be very disconcerting for people, but I'm going to tell you, there's something called the buffet effect. And the buffet effect is if you have unlimited variability, and this gets added in when you eat out more often. If you have unlimited variability, your cravings will skyrocket. It'll be absolutely enormous. And that's why people can't stick to diets. They think, oh, well, I have to be able to change my meals every time. No, you don't. No. The majority of your meals, you can have a standard set and you can stick to those. Now, you can change things up with lower calorie condiments. You can change things up with lower calorie sides, all those different types of things to give you some variability. But the basis of your meal should be relatively standard. And that makes it a lot easier to meal prep too. If you know that you're going to be eating 93% ground beef or chicken breast for multiple meals per week, you can cook an entire week's worth in 20 minutes in an Instant Pot. Make your life a lot easier. Now you've got more time to get into the gym that you said that you didn't have time for. It's going to take you a lot less time than going out and buying food every single time that you need to buy food from a restaurant. It feels like it's worse because you're doing it all at once if you're meal prepping on certain days rather than spreading it out over the week, but you're saving time overall and you're probably saving money. So these are really important things that people need to focus on top of the fact that, whole foods, they come with more phytonutrients, zoonutrients, micronutrients, cofactors, fiber, all these different things that are going to add to your health. They're going to add to your progress. They're going to add to the quality of your life that people just don't value versus pre-made foods that may not be as nutrient dense. And so when I'm talking with people about this type of stuff, I will typically say 5 to 20% of your daily calorie intake can be a discretionary calorie intake. The rest needs to be whole minimally processed foods that you've made for yourself. And what I mean by that is depending on your goals, depending on how you're responding, depending on the period in your life that you're in, 5 to 20% of that daily calorie intake can be from traditionally less nutritious foods. And you're probably okay. Under certain circumstances, it's going to need to be the higher end of that range. Under others, it's going to be the lower end of that range. If you're staying at maintenance and you're saying I'm comfortable at maintenance, you can do an 80-20, 80% whole foods, 20% discretionary food intake. If you're stepping foot on stage, you're going to be at 95 to 100%. So maybe that 95-5 is what it looks like if you're going to be a stage competitor and you want to step on stage. So it's going to be different depending on your goals. And if you're at 80-20 and you're saying, well, my goal is to lose body fat, that might not be the right range for you. You might need to be at 90-10. You might need to be at somewhere around there. 93-7 for smaller people. I think I've had some women that I've worked with that have been 108 pounds. Well, you're probably going to need to be at 95-5 because a calorie to you is much more of your daily total intake compared to a calorie of a guy that's 230 pounds. So these things are going to need to be taken into perspective on where they fit within a diet. And you can certainly incorporate some of these less nutritious foods on the daily, but it's going to have to be within bumpers. You're going to have to do it within a range that will allow you to continue to progress. And neither Doug nor I can manipulate that range. That's manipulated by biology. We cannot change what a calorie is and how it affects your body. So if you're not progressing, you need to make some changes. And that might come with some concessions to the way that you eat or how frequently you eat those less nutritious foods. And, if hunger is an issue, well, you might have to choose less calorie dense options. Maybe you're choosing the shrimp and the fish over chicken thighs. And that's just the way that it is because you're going to have to get a certain amount of protein in your daily life to be able to facilitate building lean muscle and having good body composition. You probably want a certain amount of carbs. You certainly have an essential amount of body fat or dietary fats that you're going to need. And so by keeping these things in mind with total calorie counts, you're going to be able to progress as best as you possibly can. But you need to have the basis, and the basis is building your diet off of those whole minimally processed foods that you yourself cook, because that's going to be critical in being able to understand what you're taking in and how it's affecting you.
And I've been so repetitive on the show as far as asking people what are some general things people need to do? And obviously protein matters, fiber, all the things, and we could get into that. But I think for the sake of time and also just to switch things up, I know a lot of your content revolves around just dispelling myths. We talked before we recorded that, I think my biggest roadblock over the last few years as a coach, as a trainer, is convincing people to not chase after the shiny thing and help them master the basics first before, exploring some of these things that I personally love, like sauna, cold plunge. I love the fast here and there. But I would love to get your take on what are some of the biggest myths out there regarding nutrition that you see a lot of people believing, not just people posting stuff. I'm talking that people actually believe that they need to stop believing.
You just touched on the important thing here is that mastering the basics is really what it's about. And there has never been a dietary pattern that has been shown to be superior than an omnivore standard continuous diet. There's nothing better, literally nothing better. And so if you're trying to chase something else because you think that it's going to give you unique benefits, you can stop right there because there's not. And so, fasting is one of those things that comes up a lot. And you can use a 16-8 intermittent fast perfectly fine if your goal is to lose body fat. It's probably not the best if you want to maximize lean muscle building or maximize performance, because, who would think that not eating for 16 hours would lead to the best performance? It just doesn't seem to. And so if you want to use it because it's a way for you to control calorie intake, it can work completely fine. The problem is there are a lot of promises with things like fasting that just don't actually pan out in the research. There's no benefit to fasting beyond a normal calorie deficit, like none. And this is something that hits people really hard because every time I say it, they're like, no. I've seen all this stuff about autophagy. I've seen all this stuff about GH. I've seen all this. No, there's nothing that is better about this than a standard continuous diet. Because if we look at all of this research, when you equate protein and calorie amounts, it's the same results, if not better, for the standard continuous diet in every instance. There's never been one that has shown a benefit to the fasting practices themselves outside of certain things like neurological disorders and some of these things that you probably don't have if you're asking this question about what you should do. If a doctor is telling you that you need to do this because you're going to die if you don't, please follow the doctor. But we're talking about for otherwise healthy people. This is one of those things that really gets thrown around a lot because people want to sell fasting diets. And, having said that, I do use intermittent fasting, 16-8 intermittent fasts with a lot of my clients because it's a way that they like to eat. And if their goal is fat loss, it works perfectly fine as long as we're getting in the amounts of protein that we need to get in, as long as we're getting in the essential fats that we need to get in, by the end of the day. An 8-hour window is good enough to be able to do that. But you see a lot of promises about if we go longer and longer. You see 72-hour fasts, you see even longer ones in certain periods, that you're going to upregulate autophagy and you're going to upregulate GH and all these different things. But they don't mention all the downsides. You're going to downregulate IGF-1. You're going to cause potentially lean muscle mass. You're going to cause micronutrient deficiencies. You're going to have less liver. You're going to have less proteins in the liver because you're not eating protein for long periods of time. So it lacks the amino acids that are necessary to fight off cancer. And so people love doing this, and one of the things that they say that they always like doing it for is because, it's going to be good for preventing cancer in life. And it's like, no, that's never really been shown. There is a lot of cancer research out there. And in certain forms of cancer, fasting can be a beneficial thing. In other forms of cancer, it can actually make the cancer worse. Because if you want to, kind of upregulate autophagy, well, autophagy doesn't know if it's upregulating the proliferation of cancer cells or non-cancer cells. And so people think that cancer is like this singular disease when it's really a whole bunch of disease under this umbrella topic. And so it depends on the type of cancer that you have. And fasting in an effort to prevent cancers is just kind of ignorant of the way that cancers form. You don't know if it's going to work because you don't know what kind of cancer you're going to get. So what we typically see is that these fasting practices, they don't even work at the mRNA level in skeletal muscle to begin with. So we don't really see these things giving benefits for most people. And the calorie deficit can certainly give benefits, but it tends to be in people that have excess body fat to lose. So any way that you can lose that excess body fat will work, which is why this continuous standard diet tends to work so well, because not only does it allow you to lose that body fat, it allows you to do it in a way that also gives you the chance to actually build that lean muscle. It actually gives you a chance to improve overall health. And so for these people that are chasing autophagy, particularly if you're not significantly obese, well, why don't you do something that will increase autophagy in a way that's productive? Exercise increases autophagy more than fasting in people that aren't significantly obese. So why don't you focus on exercise? Because when you're fasting, your exercise is crap. Your energy's down. You're having all these different problems because you just went on a 72-hour fast and now you're hamstringing your performance in the gym. We just spent 45 minutes talking about how much intensity in the gym matters. And now you're killing it because you're chasing this mythical longevity from fasting practices that have never been shown in humans. We have never gotten a study that shows that if you fast, it will actually increase longevity. Never. And this blows people's minds that this hasn't been shown, because there are a lot of podcasters that are claiming that it has. Never been shown. Ask them for that data. Never been shown. What they can show you is that, oh, well, you see that autophagy is upregulated a little bit, and that's a good thing, right? And it's like, well, there's a difference between some mechanisms upregulating and it being an actual net benefit. And GH, one of the things that we talked about before, that they will also point to as a benefit. This is a prime example of that. Growth hormone is upregulated when you are fasting because you are starving. Growth hormone, its effects are not mainly oriented at being anabolic to skeletal muscle tissue. They are anti-catabolic. And so while you are starving yourself, you are upregulating GH as a compensatory mechanism. Your body says, I'm starving to death. I need to do something. Otherwise, I'm going to lose all of my lean muscle and I'm probably going to die because I can't outrun that saber-toothed tiger that's chasing me, because it doesn't know that you're not a caveman anymore. So that GH increase is a compensatory mechanism. It's not a net benefit. It is there to prevent muscle wasting, not to build a lot more muscle. And so they'll tell you, oh, GH is increased during this. And you're like, oh, that's good. But they won't tell you, well, you now don't have the calories to actually use GH to build any lean muscle. And you also have IGF-1 tanking, which is more anabolic than GH. And so you're trading off a less anabolic substance, downregulating the more anabolic substance. You have no substrate to actually build any of the lean muscle. And your body is just like, I'm just holding on for dear life until this guy finally starts eating again.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the myth of fasting, and that you also explained that it can be a great tool for people for fat loss and weight loss, but it's not because of the fasting, it's because of the reducing calories. I found it to be a great tool. I mean, specifically when I was full-time training, when I was booked from 6 a.m. to noon to just train back to back to back, because some clients were cool with me eating chicken and broccoli in front of them or whatever I would be eating, or eggs. And others were like, dude, I'm paying you money. Don't eat in front of me. So I had to kind of adjust. But you're right. It's this thing that people think is this magic pill that's going to fix the fact that they're not doing the other things. Anything else that you get extremely upset about regarding myths around nutrition that people are constantly believing?
I mean, one that's not necessarily the big one right now is people are really trying to push different nutrition for those in menopause. And I know that that's probably not the focus of this show, but I want people that are listening to this to understand that there's never any research out there that suggests that you eat or train differently at any time in life, depending on, your gender or where you are in a cycle or where you are in your menopausal status. That's a really big one that's out there. And I'm happy to go into that with anybody that wants to DM me. I don't want to derail, the show when we're talking about dad bods or anything like that, but I want people to be aware of the fact that this myth is being pushed, and it's really being based off of really bad information out there. For instance, people will say, oh, once you're a woman or once you're going through menopause, you have an anabolic window, whereas men don't. And they'll base it off of a 1980s nitrogen excretion data study where we have actual data in women showing that if you take the protein, it doesn't really matter what, the timing for the anabolic window type thing. And maybe that's a good one to discuss right here. Anabolic window is something that I actually still hear a lot of times, and I'm probably hearing it more because of this female angle that is being thrown around where women have an anabolic window and men don't. That's literally never been shown. And if you actually look at the outcome data in those studies, you can see that women don't have an anabolic window that's different from men. But it's being pushed because of really, really poor research. You don't use the worst level of research to counterbalance the best level of research. If you have outcome data in actual functioning people that are training and you look at different time periods of protein intake, your mechanistic data that doesn't yield benefits doesn't counterbalance that data that shows that it doesn't yield benefits. And I think that people really have this weird viewpoint of, well, if people say something that sounds interesting to me or different, then it must be right, especially if they've got a larger following size. And so the anabolic window was always one of those big things that people talked about a whole lot. And it's nuanced And, for both men and women that are learning to really set up their nutrition and they want to be able to set this up correctly, it's not that there is this magical 30-minute window after your workout that you have to get in, 25 or 30 grams of protein. It's not necessary during that time period. What we seem to see when we look at the breadth of research is that there's about a 6-hour time period around your training that is like an anabolic barn door. And so whether or not we need to eat directly after seems to be more dependent on what we've been doing in the hours before. And if you've had a meal with a significant amount of protein in the few hours before, it's probably less critical to get it immediately after. You probably have a few hours after that you can probably do that. But even these types of things pale in comparison to total daily intake. So if you're struggling with this type of nutrient timing, if you're struggling to get your total daily calories, your total daily protein in, focus on that total daily and however you can. If you're doing that religiously for long periods of time and you're not having any trouble, that's when you start to focus on some of these nutrient timing strategies. That's when those can start to become more beneficial because they can give you benefits, but it's probably going to be a smaller percentage compared to, that major benefit over long term. And so this is another one of those things, just like when we were talking about training, it's what can we do to simplify a person's life? And the macro view is get your total daily intakes down. Once you start to be able to do that, that's when you start to focus on some of these changes that could make some differences. And if you're getting up and you're training in the morning after an overnight fast, which is what sleeping is, we don't in the short term see major differences in like hypertrophy as long as you get, protein shortly after. But in short-term studies, we do see more strength progress if you actually are fed in some way prior to training, if after, 8 hours of sleeping. So it makes sense to me to think, hey, if you're going to train first thing in the morning and you don't want to get in a big meal, maybe it does make sense to have like an apple or a protein shake or something like that, because if we can increase strength progress over time, that's probably going to lead to more hypertrophy progress over time. And we just haven't seen that because it's really hard to take studies out really long periods of time to see that hypertrophy progress, because the reality is 12 weeks probably isn't enough to see these benefits. But theoretically, it could make sense, but outside of some of these like small nutrient timing things, don't waste your time worrying about the minutia. Actually focus on what really matters. And that's that whole minimally processed food that we were talking about, controlling, your intake by cooking yourself, making sure that you're getting adequate protein on the daily. And whether you're a man or a woman at whatever stage in life, all of these things still hold true. And so you can start to focus on how you can do this the best for you and less on the minutia or, these different influencers that are trying to sell their own training programs that may be based off of fear mongering rather than actual data.
Well, Allan, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your wisdom. If people want to find you on social media, connect with you, where's the best place to do that?
You can check me out on my website, mauiathletics.com. I've got all of my social media links at the bottom. You can click on those to check me out, or reach out to me on Instagram, at Dr. Allan Bacon. Just make sure that you spell my first name right, Allan.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate the invite, and it was a great talk with you.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.